Now let's get to our lesson tonight. Nehemiah Chapter 7. If you've ever tried to read Nehemiah Chapter 7, you're in for a challenge. I did not count how many names are in this chapter. And a lot of these names are very difficult names. And I practiced. I listened to Alexander Scorby read those names. If you get some Old Testament tapes or recordings, you can learn how to pronounce some of these men by listening to people read them. And Alexander Scorby did a good job. But let me tell you, he's guessing at a lot of these. Just how do you pronounce that name? He's not. I can tell he's guessing at some. And I certainly would. And I would encourage you to go through that and at least look at all those names. Maybe formulate in your head something like you think they would sound like. I'm not going to try to read all of those names tonight, but you'll see them all on the screens that are up here before you as we get through. Now, I want to illustrate something right here as we begin. I called this, and I got this, I think this is out of verse 5. Nehemiah 7, verse 5. I kind of like to give a title to my sermons and all. Instead of just Nehemiah 7, it's a register of the genealogy of them that came up at the first. You see what's wrong with that, don't you? You don't in the cars, but everyone in here can see that instead of typing genealogy, I just have a register of the geology. Well, I was copying it down. That's what you call a copyist error. That was my mistake. If I had been writing that chapter down, someone wants a copy of this, and I didn't have a photocopy machine or a printing press or something, okay, I'll write it down for them. And I'm writing a chapter like this with all of these names and with all of these numbers. It would be very easy for me to miscopy something, wouldn't it? I did it right here, and I shouldn't have made that mistake, but I did that. This list of names, and this whole chapter here we're looking at, is very, very similar to Ezra chapter 2. And it's really amazing how well those things follow right along with each other, but they don't do so exactly. And a lot of the place it's messed up is in the numbers. And I tell you, these numbers, they're kind of like these Hebrew numbers. They're sort of like, they're not Roman numerals, but you can imagine, it's not the Aramaic system that we're used to writing, 1, 2, 3, and that'd be hard enough to get all the numbers right. You can invert numbers easily that way. But what if it was all in Roman numerals? Oh, how difficult it would be to get all those X's and I's and C's and everything, and the M's all in the right place and just right, because sometimes they have to be switched around for different numbers. You know how Roman numerals are. And in the old Hebrew, their number system is that difficult. And a lot of the differences in Ezra 2 and in Nehemiah 7 has to do with the numbers. And most of them they can say, well, now, that looks like that would be a copyist error. And it could be a copyist error. When people talk about the contradictions and mistakes that are in the Bible, that's what they're talking about. What if it said instead of 232, it said 223? What if that's the difference? What difference is that making? Well, it's a very, very small, infinitesimal thing. And it may not even be that. It could be that we're talking about two different surveys that they have made. And when you're talking about how many people are in a certain village or something, that number changes. The census changes every time it's taken. And it could be two different census that were made at a very similar time, and the number shifted in between time. That might be another reason for this difference. And most people are not going to pour through in that kind of detail to even know that there even was a difference there. But I think it helps illustrate just what we have when we have the Bible like this. And there could be in little places like that maybe a copyist error, because these things are copied by men from one to another. And it doesn't destroy the confidence we have in the Scriptures, not one whit, in things like this, does it? And so, just point that out. Now, let's look at this, and we'll go through chapter 7. I want to, and because it's a chapter, if you do like me and you're reading through the Bible, and you come to Nehemiah chapter 7, it's kind of a nice place to maybe shift it up into speed gear, and just kind of skim through that, and I bet you've done it and not paid real close attention to line after line after line of strange name and difficult number as you've gone through there. But now in preparing for this lesson, I did that. And there's some interesting things that show up in this as we do it, and we'll look at that. First, we've got memory work. Here it is, Nehemiah chapter 7, verses 2 and 3. That I gave my brother Hanani and Hananiah, the ruler of the palace, charge over Jerusalem. For he was a faithful man, and feared God above many. And I said unto them, let not the gates of Jerusalem be open until the sun be hot. And while they stand by, let them shut the doors and bar them, and appoint watches of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, every one in his watch, and every one to be over against his house. Well, there's your memory verse. Let's see what this is talking about. Start Nehemiah chapter 7. Now it came to pass, when the wall was built, and I had set up the doors. Remember the last chapter, he hadn't set the doors up yet. And that's when they said, come down to the plain of Ono. And he said, oh no. And so he got the walls built now. Now the doors are set. And then he said, and the porters, and the signers, and the singers, and the Levites were appointed. Now, exactly to what they were appointed, some particular office, maybe to get the temple services back in order or something like that. Who are the porters? Well, if you have another translation, it might say the gatekeepers. And that seems likely who these porters are, concerning some instructions we're going to receive here in a few moments. The singers would be those like the sons of Asaph that would sing the psalms at the tabernacle for the worship. And the Levites were those that helped the priests care for the holy things. Now they're appointed. There's getting some order now in the city now that they've got the walls built. And then he said that I gave my brother Hanani. You remember Hanani? It's in the first chapter. That Hanani shows up at Shushan the palace where Nehemiah is, and Nehemiah asks him, how is Jerusalem? And he tells them the walls are down. And it's because of the word of his brother Hanani that Nehemiah went before the king to get permission to get those walls up. Well, here his brother shows up again. My brother Hanani and Hananiah. The word and. It could be talking about two things. But the word that's translated and here can also mean even. He could be saying my brother Hanani, even Hananiah. Maybe Hananiah sort of short, like we might say Pete, even Peter. Or it may be Bill, even William, and giving his full name there, not just the short name. And it talks about him as though he's one man. That could be two men. But it could be that this Hanani and Hananiah here is the same person. It says he's the ruler of the palace. He gave him charge over Jerusalem, for he was a faithful man. And that word faithful is used in the the sense, he's someone you could count on. He knew how to accept responsibility and carry that responsibility out. You ask him to do something, you know it's going to be done well. It's going to be done right. He's a faithful man, and he feared God above many. In several places in this book of Nehemiah, we're talking about those that fear God, aren't we? All right. And I said to them, now he may be talking to the porters here, about when to open and close the gates. Now let not the gates of Jerusalem be open till the sun be hot. And while they stand by, let them shut the doors and bar them, and appoint watches of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, every one in his watch, and every one to be over against his house. He's talking about defending the city. You don't just leave the gates open and then don't watch. No, if the gates are open, you've got watches. And if you shut the gate, you still need to keep watches out. And when exactly are these gates opened or closed? And that's not the significant thing, and it's a little ambiguous here. Some say, well, that'd be about mid-morning when the sun gets hot. That's when we would open the gates. And others have suggested, no. When the sun gets hot, that'd be afternoon, and so they're going to close the gates and take a rest now in the heat of the day, but we're going to keep watch out while the gates are closed. And kind of depends on how they translate it or interpret those words. But the point is, they're going to be opening and closing the gates at different times, and they're going to be keeping watch to keep that city defended. And then he looks at this city. Now the city was large and great, but the people were few therein, and the houses were not builded. They spent all their times on the walls, and now what about within that city? And God put it into mine heart. There was a time when David numbered the people, and God didn't want David to do it. But this time God does want Nehemiah to number the people. And so he's doing things by the instruction of God. God put it into my heart to gather together the nobles and the rulers and the people, that they might be reckoned by genealogy. And I found a register of the genealogy of them which came up at the first, and found written therein. Now that's what we're going to look at. And this is the genealogy, this is the record. It's very similar now to Ezra chapter 2. And he says, these are the children of the province that went up out of the captivity, of those that had been carried away, who Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away, and came again to Jerusalem and to Judah, every one into his city. Now, wouldn't it have been the same people? There could have been 180 years from the time Nehemiah had destroyed Jerusalem to the time that these people had come back. I'd say maybe about 150 years. Wouldn't have been the same people. And so it's a little odd. Do we know, are these the numbers of those that went out? I take this to be the numbers of those that came back, that had come from those that had gone out. But I want you to notice this. It says here, they came with Zerubbabel and Jeshua. Well, that's another name for Joshua. And this is not the Joshua that followed Moses. This Zerubbabel was the man that first led the people back out of Babylon. We read about him in the first of Ezra. And when he came back, the high priest at that time was this Jeshua. And so these are those that came back, a register of them, and it mentions Nehemiah. But that's not this Nehemiah, because this Nehemiah came several years later. And so we've got Bible names that we might recognize, but it's not necessarily the people we might be thinking about when we read those names. And then we've got some other names: Azariah, Remiah, Nehemiah, Mordecai. Remember him? Well, he was the cousin of Esther in the book of Esther, but probably not the same man, Mordecai here. And then others that are mentioned here. The number of the people of Israel was this. Now here's the register. And we've got these names. I want you to notice those two names there. Parosh and Shephatiah. Now, as we look at these names, look at some more. Look at some more. See these names? These names. And so are these the names of people? Or are these the names of villages? And I'm going to show you these names. Now, you'll recognize a name every now and then going through here. And I recognize more names of villages than I do of people. For example, you going down there, this Pathath Moab, that just sounds like a place. Pathath of Moab, doesn't it? That sounds more like a place than a person. And if I read this, the children of Pathath Moab, of the children of, and then here's the names, Jeshua and Joab, that wouldn't be the Joab that was with David. This would be another man named Joab. Of Jeshua and Joab, 2,818. If I'm reading this correctly, and I'll stand corrected on this if someone thinks they can know this better than me, and they probably can. I'm not trying to be haughty here, but I'm reading that from Pathath Moab, 2,818 came back out of Babylon into Israel. And that had been their hometown. You recognize the place of Elam. Now, some of these I don't recognize as either a name of a person or of a village. They're just names. And they're the children of, are they the children of the place or children of the person? And I'm inclined to believe most of these are really places instead of people. Look down here. I don't really notice anyone there except Hezekiah. The children of altar of Hezekiah. Well, was altar a place or a person? Is it the village of Hezekiah or a descendant of Hezekiah? I'm inclined to believe they're places. Going on, look at these names. You see that verse 25, the children of Gibeon, that's a place. Gibeon was. And then the men of Bethlehem, Bethlehem's a place. We know about Bethlehem. I want you to notice here there's a shift. He's been talking about the children of, and he mentions different places like Gibeon. But then when it comes to Bethlehem, it's the men of Bethlehem and of Netophah. Why that switch from the children of them to the men of them? Well, I could not find a good answer for that, but I found it interesting that the switch was made. Anathoth, that's a place. I recognize that as a place name. Kirjath Jearim, that's a place. Beeroth, that's a place. That's a village that we read about. Lod, that's a place. Ono, we know about Ono. Come down to Ono and meet with us before you set up those gates. And Nehemiah said, no. So we're talking about a place here. Ono. Looking on down, we're going back to the children now. Instead of talking about the men of, beginning in verse 7, it goes back to the children of these places. I just found that interesting. Maybe there's a good explanation for that. It wouldn't be highly significant. I just think it would be interesting to understand why that switch was there. All right, coming on down. The priest. The priest. Special attention made to the priest. See, everyone couldn't be a priest. If you're going to be a priest, you had to show that you're a descendant of Aaron. Because it was Aaron, the brother of Moses, and his sons that were the priests. Now Aaron was of the tribe of Levi, and Levi is the priestly tribe. But all of Levi were not priests, only those descendant of Aaron. And so this is going to show up here later in this chapter why this is so important. The priests, the children of Jedediah, the house of Jeshua, and now we're talking about men there, Jedediah and Jeshua, those are people. And maybe some of these others are people here. Amur, Pashur, Harim, the Levites. Now that's the larger tribe, not just the priests, but the tribe the priests are from. And again, the children of Jeshua and some other. The singers. And it mentions the children of Asaph in the inscriptions on the Psalms. Several times you look, and before we have the text of the Psalm, it might say a Psalm for the children of Asaph. And when you read in the book of Chronicles about the appointment of singers, it talks about the children of Asaph being appointed those singers. And we read earlier here how he had appointed the singers, so they'd kept up with that. The children of Asaph are still the singers here at the temple. And then it mentions the porters. Well, the gatekeepers, as some translations put that. And it just mentions the names. We don't have the number. Well, we do have the number right down there. A lot of this, though, is just names, name, and put them all together. And then the 138 is the number at the end. And then look at verse 46. The Nethinims. Well, now what are we talking about? It's a Hebrew word. It's not an English word. Imagine you're back in the early 1600s. And the king says, translate the Old Testament for me, and you come across this Hebrew word, and you don't know what it means. You don't know what it means. What are you going to do? Make up a word? On sometimes they did. They took a good guess at what the word would mean. But on this one, they just gave us the Hebrew word. And they didn't try to come up with an English word to explain what that word means. But now, many years later, others have looked at this and they say that word stands for those who had been set apart. Dedicated is the root meaning of that Hebrew word. And so I read a translation that called this, now they're guessing here, but they're calling these the temple servants. And that's a pretty good guess about what that word might mean. And so we'll call it that for here now, the temple servants. And again, you have a lot of names without necessarily a number associated with them. Look at all those names. I'm glad I'm not reading all this to you, aren't you? You would laugh at me as I stumbled over these. But I wouldn't laugh at you if you tried. I would be proud of you for trying. Maybe I should have tried. More of these names. And then verse 57. The children of Solomon's servants. Okay, we've got some more names here to describe those, identifying those of Solomon. The thing that's interesting here is they kept up with that. They took a record. It wasn't just a haphazard transport into Babylon and back, but someone says, let's get this written down. Let's see where they're from. And they kept up with who they were and where they were from with the idea. Someday we'll go back and we'll be able to identify ourselves as one of the children of Israel that belong in this land. So we're going to keep up with these records. And they did that. Now, coming on down through here, here's those Nethinims again, and the children of Solomon's servants, put them all together, 392. And these were they, verse 61, these were they which went up also from, now these sound like place names, don't they? Since they came from these places. But now notice at the end of that verse, they could not show their father's house nor their seed whether they were of Israel. Some of them had gone over there and gotten over in the Bible and came back, and they can't show their citizenship. They can't show that they are of Israel. They've been with the Israelites, but they can't make that connection now that we're of the children of Israel. Well, what about them? Well, you read some of them here. Tobiah is mentioned among there. I wonder if that's that Tobiah that was giving Nehemiah problems. It could be that Tobiah. But here they are, some of these names. And then it says in verse 63, look at this. And of the priest. And then we've got these three names. Habiah, Koz, and Barzillai. And tells a little bit about, he took one of the daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, to wife, and was called after their name. But notice verse 64. These sought their register among those that were reckoned by the genealogy, but it was not found. Therefore were they as polluted from the priesthood. So, and then it mentions here that they couldn't eat of the most holy things till there stood up a priest with the Urim and the Thummim. Well, here they were saying, wait a minute, we're priests. But if they couldn't show their connection with Aaron and his descendants, they couldn't prove they were the priest. And so they clean out those. That you can't serve as a priest. And you're not going to be able to partake of the holy things. That'd be like the showbread that they would prepare, the meat from the sacrifices, until they found the priest with the Urim and the Thummim. Now you read about that in Moses, and it was this breastplate that had these stones. And there was some manner in which they could consult God through that breastplate. And maybe depending on what stone they picked out or how it worked, we don't really know. But God would let them know through that Urim and Thummim what His will would be. So it's kind of like answering simple questions. Yes or no? Is this right or wrong? Should we do this or not? And the Urim and Thummim would answer. And maybe until we can find out and verify that these men are of the priestly tribe, they can't serve as priests. And so 66, the whole congregation together was 42,303 score, beside their manservants and their maidservants, of whom there were 7,337, and they had 245 singing men and singing women. And if you put all that together, not an exact number, but we're talking about 50,000 people that came back from Babylon to return to Jerusalem. And then it talks about their livestock. They had a number of horses, a number of mules, the number of camels, and the number of the asses that came back with them. So it's a pretty interesting survey that they took here. And then it says that some of the chief of the fathers gave into the work. Okay, now this is like a receipt. They came back and they took their money and they put their money into the work, either to the temple or to the building of the walls, and we got their names. This is kind of like we'll give them this receipt, and that receipt is written down in this register. And so it talks about the gold that they gave and the garments that they gave and the treasure that they gave, and it mentions like 2,200 pounds of silver, and so it took a record of what it was that they had given. And so the last verse. So the priest and the Levites and the porters, maybe the gatekeepers here, and the singers, and some of the people, and the Nethinims, is that the temple servants, perhaps? And all Israel, they dwelt in their cities, and when the 7th month came, the children of Israel were in their cities. Well, that's the chapter. Why would that be in the Bible? Well, I found it interesting to look at all of that, and I'll tell you, what we've got when we have the Bible, we have a real book. I bet that register was a lot more important for them at that time than it is for us for now. And yet it's been preserved. And it makes these stories real. They really did this. And they took these records, and so we have copies of those records they make. And the fact that it doesn't line up exactly with Ezra chapter 2, if anything, that shows me how that there was very much care spent in copy. I guess it'd been pretty easy for someone along the way said, let's correct these up and make these look just alike. But no, they're different. And we're going to write it down and pass it on to the future generation, just like they are. And that should give us confidence in the rest of the Scriptures too, that they're trying to record them and copy them and hand them down to just as they are, and not go through there and fiddle with it and try to make it sound good to them. So in a backhanded way, it kind of can build our confidence that we have in the integrity of those that have passed these things on down to us, can't they? They took records. They took records. God keeps records. He knows who you are. He knows your hometown. He knows where you've been. He knows where you ought to be. He knows your name. And He's got your name in the book of life because He loves you. And He wants you with Him. And if you turn from Him, He'll blot your name out of the book of life. But you don't want that. He wants your name to stay there. And if they thought that was important to take these records, don't you know it's important for God to keep His records? It's not a literal book. God doesn't need to have to write it down. That's not what He's talking about that to explain it to us. God knows you. He knows everything about you. And He's kept up with you. And He wants you to come back. So if you've wandered away, no. God wants you back. He knows all about this. He knows where you ought to be. And you can come back tonight. And you need to be baptized into Christ, do that. And if you need to return otherwise, then do that as we stand and sing this invitation song.